Welcome to the next presentation in the series, Analyzing Prophecies, the Beast of Revelation. Before we get started, a little bit of a disclaimer here. This topic is highly controversial, as most prophecies are. And some people will say, well, this is just an interpretation. And they would be right. It's one of many. However, the very purpose of doing this presentation is not so much to talk about the prophecy, but to talk about the different methodologies for understanding biblical text, using the Pardes method and using the method of equivalency. The method of equivalency is where you have a symbol or some type of idea, and it is equivalent to another idea. It is used in place as a placeholder. As a programmer, I understand the idea of variables. Variables hold a value, and let's say that the variable name is juice. And you can put different values into that variable: orange juice, tomato juice, grape juice, but the variable always means juice. And so many times when we see these symbolic things in the Bible, when the Bible uses these symbolisms, they have an equivalency, a meaning that is equivalent, or its actual meaning. And so we're going to take a look at that method as well as the Pardes method, where we're going to look at it literally. We're going to look at the what it means figuratively and prophetically. We're not going to really go into Kabbalah too much at this point, but we will take a look at this prophecy on these different levels. So to start out, Revelation is the story of the end times. Sometimes it's called the apocalypse. And a lot of people get this idea in their head of this cataclysmic thing that is going to happen. And so they have in their head these strange supernatural events, when really the word apocalypse means to reveal or to make known. And so Revelation really is a good interpretation of what the whole book is about. It is not about some cataclysmic supernatural event. It is just a glimpse into an event that, from the biblical standpoint, or from the standpoint of the Elohim, it is a pivotal moment in human history. And so the whole Bible seems to be wrapped around this event that we've come to call the Day of Judgment. Revelation is filled with symbolisms, from big dragons and the harlot, locusts coming out of the abyss, all of these wonderful, wonderful images, but they all have a meaning. And so part of what we're going to do today is look at what some of those meanings could possibly be. The other thing that people don't know is that Revelation borrows very heavily from the Old Testament. It's almost entirely a rewrite of what was already written from before. And John did this on purpose. He stitched together these various prophecies as if to say, these are really all talking about one thing. These aren't separate prophecies that we're looking at. These old prophets, even though they wrote at different times in history, and they wrote about various events from the standpoint of Israel, if you took them all and stitched them together, they really are all talking about the Day of Judgment, which has to do with all of humanity. And he comes to help us to understand what the Day of Judgment really is all about, what it means, and what significance it should have for us. So now let's take a look at some of the various interpretations that are out there. One of the criticisms that most people seem to harp on is that, well, when you're talking about prophecies, like the prophecies of Nostradamus, for example, you can interpret those however you want to. You can throw anything into the symbolic language, this poetic language. You can take it and make it mean anything. But I want to show today that that's really not true. That if you follow the methods of Pardes and the law of equivalency, that it narrows down and keeps narrowing down the different possibilities that something can be to almost, it can only be one thing. Whereas if you just take Revelation as a standalone prophecy, if you don't look at what John himself is pointing at, what he's actually referencing, if you don't take all of those things into consideration, yeah, you can interpret it pretty much however you want to. But this methodology that I'm going to show will put that little puppy to bed. In order for us to come to an accurate interpretation, it must conform to all the aspects. That is, every time John references some other prophecy, whatever conclusions we come to must conform to all the elements from every prophecy that he is referencing. And if it doesn't, then it can't possibly be the right thing. So let's talk about popular interpretations. The very first one is Nero. Today we're going to look at Revelation chapter 13, which is about the beast of Revelation, the beast that rises out of the sea. And many Bible scholars point to the beast as being Nero. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, Nero was an emperor of Rome. And Rome was a city that sat on 7 hills. And so the 7 heads, which in chapter 17 of Revelation says there are 7 mountains, that people took that literally and said, okay, well, Rome sits on 7 mountains. And so Nero, like the Great Harlot, is sitting on top of the city of Rome. He's the head of this great city, and therefore he's the beast and the harlot that sits upon these 7 mountains. Nero also is the first emperor of Rome that started to, persecute the Christians. He's the first one that threw them into the arena with hungry lions for entertainment. And that tradition kind of continued until Constantine came along and took over the Christian organization. This next interpretation is the papacy. And why? Because Constantine nominated himself not the first pope, but the second after St. Peter. And he, even though there were 300 years in between Peter and Constantine, and there's no evidence of there ever being a pope in those 300 years, Constantine made himself the pope and nominated Peter as being the first one to rule in Christ's place until the Christ returns. So many people see the Pope as being this beast that comes up out of the sea. He again, the Vatican sits on 7 hills, and so there's that seven mountains again, the 7 hills, and he sits on top of an organization that has statues of saints and Jesus and Mary, and so many people say that this is the false prophet. He's out there leading people astray, leading them to idolatry. And so they say, well, it must be the Pope. Okay? And lastly, there are people who say that Revelation 13 is about some distant future, something that hasn't happened yet. And so we don't know what these things point to, but it's some supernatural occurrence that when it happens, we'll just all be very well assured of what those aspects are. So let's take a look at the actual prophecies here. I need to get my Bible out, and I'm going to read some scriptures that are going to go along with this. And we're going to start off with Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. So the very first thing we come to is he stood upon the sand of the sea. And this is our first opportunity to see the law of equivalency at work. Here, the sea, we can imagine a sea, but in chapter 17, John tells us exactly what the sea is. And he says to me, he says, come hither, and I will show to thee the judgment of the great harlot that sits upon many waters. And he saith unto me in verse 15, the waters thou sawest where the whore sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So the very first thing is the sea is equal to peoples, nations, and tongues. Now what we really need to ask ourselves, if John has given us this equivalency, does it hold up to the rest of the Bible? That is, could I go back and look at other scriptures where waters are mentioned, or the sea, and find evidence that it really stands for peoples, nations, and tongues? And the answer to that is yes. For example, when Balaam blessed Israel and he said, your seed will be in many waters, he meant that Israel's seed would propagate into many nations and tongues. When the Assyrians came up against Israel, and it's described as the many waters flowing over Israel, well, those were the armies of Assyria. And so they were the peoples, nations, and tongues that Assyria had conquered and had conscripted into their army. And so we see that this ideology, this equivalency, can flow backwards and is true at all points in the Bible, that you can use this equivalency and find a whole brand new meaning. So when you read the scripture again and you see that, for example, that Leviathan is in the seas, well, when you substitute peoples, nations, and tongues for the sea, Leviathan is in the people. And so you get a whole brand new meaning, and you can go back, and as you're picking out and figuring out these equivalencies, you can then unlock new meanings out of the Bible. And that's exactly the way it's like little steps. Once you take this step, once you get this idea out, it'll manifest other things, and then once you get those things, it'll manifest more. So it's like an onion that you have to keep peeling back layers and layers and layers of stuff. So we're going to continue on here. So it talks about the beast, and this beast that comes out of the sea is exactly the same as the beast that Daniel saw. And Daniel saw those beasts in Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 3. He says, and 4 beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. The first was like a lion, and behold, a second, is like a bear. And after this, behold, and lo, another like a leopard. And then there was a 4th beast that was terrible and dreadful and exceedingly strong. So, and this one is the one that had 10 horns and, all the horns in the head. But we see here that John, instead of showing them as 4 separate beasts the way Daniel did, he showed them all as one continuous beast. It only had the paws of the bear, and it had the body of the leopard. and it had heads like a lion. And so he took all four of those beasts and he put them up together into one. But he did it so that we would go back, to let us know that we need to go back and look at Daniel's beast. And whatever this beast is that's rising up out of the sea would have these same characteristics that Daniel was talking about. So in order to understand the beast of Revelation, we need to first understand Daniel's beast. Well, the Bible says a lot about this beast, and Bible scholars have been studying this for quite a while. And the conclusion that they came to is that the first beast that Daniel talked about, the beast that is like the lion, is actually Babylon. And why is that? Because historically, when Daniel was writing, he was in exile in Babylon, and so he starts there. And the three first beasts that he talks about are the three that he actually gives names to in the totality of his prophecies. He has named them already. And so the first in that series would be Babylon. And Babylon is a very important civilization to the Jews. First of all, many Jewish rabbis look at Babylon as being near where the Garden of Eden started out from. If we go back to Genesis and we take a look at that description, we see that two of the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, go through the Garden of Eden. And the modern day Tigris and Euphrates rivers are there in Iraq. And they used to run very close to where Babylon now sits. So depending on how big the Garden of Eden is, if we say that it was a huge area, we could actually say that Babylon was somewhere in that vicinity. And so a lot of rabbis believe that. The second thing about Babylon is that it's also very close to where Abraham came from. Abraham lived in the city of Ur, which was a suburb of Babylon. It was right outside of Babylon. And he came from that region. And so Israel itself has its beginnings near Babylon. Now we're talking about Daniel, and Daniel again is starting with Babylon. The first city that is mentioned in the Bible after the flood is Babylon. We talk about Nimrod, who built the Great Tower of Babel in Babylon. And so Babylon takes on this historic role, not only of being the first, or this place where there is the Garden of Eden, and then it gets corrupted and turned into this place of opposition. But then Israel starts from there through Abraham. And Abraham is this little piece of Babylon that is something that is clean and good. And it builds, Israel. And then Israel gets corrupted, right? And then it goes back into exile, into Babylon again. And then the remnant of those gets sent home to rebuild the temple. And there's this cycle of things that keep happening over and over again. And so Babylon becomes a symbol of the Garden of Eden, the place of peace, the kingdom even. But it also shows that it can be corrupted. It can be brought down. The next kingdom after Babylon, from Daniel's perspective, is Media-Persia. We talked about it before, how Cyrus came and diverted the Euphrates River, marched into Babylon, and took it over in a single night. Slayed a lot of Babylonians. And then at some point he set Israel free to go back and rebuild the temple. So the second one of a bear is Media-Persia. The third symbol is Greece. And believe it or not, Daniel talks about both Media Persia, which is now blended with Babylon, which is the three ribs in the bear's mouth. The three ribs are the three kingdoms. And he also talks about Greece. Here, the leopard has four heads, and we talked about how Greece was split after Alexander the Great died. His kingdom was split into four parts by his four generals. But let's talk about Greece a little bit, and let's look at the prophecy regarding Greece. So originally, Daniel in chapter 8 sees a ram, and this ram is Media Persia. And the ram is pushing into the west, the north, and the south, and nothing can withstand it. And then along comes a he-goat, and this he-goat is very, very strong, and it has a single great horn on top of its head. And it kicks over the ram and begins to trample upon it, and nothing can save the ram. After that, the great horn is broken, and four horns come up in its place. That's in chapter 8. And so that's exactly what happened. Now, at the time of Daniel, Greece, as we think about it, didn't exist. They were separate city-states of Thessalonica, Thebes, Athens, Sparta. All of these different city-state kingdoms were their own separate countries. And Alexander's father, Philip of Macedonia, went on a little war campaign, and he united all of these separate city-states into one massive country of Greece. And at the time of Daniel, that didn't exist. That didn't happen until maybe 300 years later, 250, 300 years later. So his prophecy regarding Greece is pretty amazing when you think about it. But it's more than that. He actually mentions Greece by name. If we go over into chapter 8, verse 20, the ram that thou sawest having the two horns are the kings of Media Persia. So here we have Media Persia. And he talks about the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, in the Bible, the word here used for first king could mean the first in a series or the greatest, the one that is the biggest and the greatest. And so we can take it now that Alexander the Great was not the first king because his father was. His father, King Philip of Macedonia, was the first king of Greece. He was actually the second. But Alexander was the greatest king because he not only kept all of Greece united, he expanded the empire all the way over into India. And one of the first battles that he fought was against Persia. And he defeated Babylon as one of the very first cities that he conquered. And as he went along, he went towards the east and towards India. And when he saw the elephants of the Indian armies, he decided, I've seen enough, I've gone far enough, and he turned around and he went back to Babylon, and he mysteriously got ill in that fateful city. So again, this is a very important city, even to Greece. And Alexander got sick, and he died right in Babylon. And that is when his generals split the kingdom, this vast kingdom that Alexander had just conquered, into four parts. Now, after Greece comes Rome. And Rome conquers all the Greek lands, and it has a superior army, and it adopts all of the Greek ways. One of the things about Alexander is he lived at the time of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and Euclid and Pythagoras. He lived at that time when Greece went down into Alexandria in Egypt, and they learned some of the secrets of the Egyptian mystery schools and brought those things back. And that's when their philosophy really took off. And they came up with the idea of democracy. Well, Rome kept those ideas, whereas the Greeks never really put them into practice, or if they tried it, they failed miserably. Rome actually had a republic, and it had a senator. It had a group of senators that ruled. Now, those senators were made up of the aristocracy, the landowners, the great families, the great founding families. And of course, they made laws that were beneficial to themselves, not necessarily to the common people. But it was set up as a republic, as a representative democracy. And all of that changed under Julius Caesar, who came in with his armies, crossed the Rubicon, and declared himself Imperator of Rome. And the emperors just kept coming after that. But one of the things that Julius Caesar did is he filled the Senate House with an equal number of plebs, of the common people, so that the aristocracy would have an equal vote to the plebeians. And therefore, there would be a little more justice, a little more even-handedness with the lawmaking. And that idea is what really caused the senators to stab Caesar, or ambush him on the Senate steps and stab him to death, because they didn't like the idea of their power being diminished. They wanted to have their land and eat it too. So anyway, Rome borrowed from Greece. It was a child of Greece. Now, Daniel talks about Greece, and he talks about the four horns, how Greece was split into four parts. And he says, out of one of those horns, after it's split into four, out of one of those, in verse 9, he says, comes a little horn, which waxes exceedingly great towards the south and towards the east and towards the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts and the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. So we get this description of a great horn that does battle with God, I guess. And this horn is a descendant of Greece. It's a descendant. Greece splits into four parts, and then something from out of Greece becomes this thing that is against God. Well, the fourth beast, and we're talking about the fourth beast of Rome and the Holy Roman Empire, has that same description. It talks about the fourth beast, the one that is dreadful and exceedingly great, it has iron teeth. He says, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom were three of the first plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. Okay, so in one prophecy, in the prophecy of Greece, the four horns, one of those horns sprout off this blasphemous little horn. And then the first prophecy of these four beasts, where we know that the last one is Rome, because Rome took over Greece. Somewhere it has 10 horns that come up, and then out of those 10 come up another horn, and it's that little horn that comes up amongst the 10 that winds up being the blasphemous horn. And so we're seeing a progression. Babylon defeated by Persia defeated by Greece defeated by Rome. But the 10 horns that sprout out of Rome's head are not 10 kingdoms that came and took over Rome. No. When Rome fell, it had conquered a vast, massive area, most of Europe. And when Rome fell out of power, those European countries split up into separate countries. And so even though they were still in the area of Rome, they didn't conquer Rome. They were Rome. They just split into 10 parts. And so we have these 10 European nations that came out of Rome called the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire was made up of 10 kingdoms: England, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Switzerland are the 7 that still remain with us to this day. The Heruli, Vandals, and Ostrogoths all disappeared or were absorbed into the remaining 7. And so the prophecy says, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And so we see that that's true. 3 of these nations are missing before this last and final horn comes into place. Well, the question comes, what didn't take over Rome, but came up out of the 10 horns, these 10 European countries? What country was started or came up out of these 10 European countries, 3 of whom were missing by the time it appeared? And there's only one answer for that: the United States. So when we talk about the little horn, we know that the fourth beast grows this horn. We know also that it must be a son of Greece. And guess what? The United States was founded on these same principles of Greece. In fact, our capital, Washington, D.C., is modeled after the Greek Parthenon. We recognize that we are sons of Greece. We're sons of Greece with our ideology of democracy. We can trace our history back from the European kingdoms to Rome, back to Greece. It is a direct connection. We also see that 3 of the horns were plucked out. 3 of these original European countries were gone by the time this final horn made its appearance. But there's another interesting thing about the birthplace, the birthing of the United States, that is very, very interesting. And maybe we should talk about that. When the United States was colonized, it was not its own country. The 13 colonies were actually British colonies. And there were 2 other kingdoms that had claimed parts of what we now call the United States. And those other 2 countries were France and Spain. So in order for the United States to become its own country, to not be ruled by any other nation, not have any other nation as its head, it had to defeat three horns. It had to defeat Britain, Spain, and France. Now, we know about 1776 and the War of Independence against Britain. And that's how we got free of King George of Britain. Napoleon, who, when we had our independence, War of Independence from Britain over here in the United States, France also had its own revolution 10 years later, which Thomas Jefferson actually helped to go foment. He actually left the United States, took a ship over to France, and helped them to start their own revolution over there. And then when things started to get really nasty, he ran back to the United States and left a big mess there called the Terror. And during the Terror, people were being guillotined, both rich man and poor man alike, wound up in the guillotine. And the guillotines were working day and night during the Terror. And then there arose a general called Napoleon Bonaparte. And Bonaparte united the people together and stopped the Terror. And he decided that he was going to conquer the rest of Europe and annex it into the French Empire. But as time went on and the wars got costly, he needed money. So he decided to sell Louisiana. And at the time, Louisiana included Mississippi and different, it was a huge territory. And so we bought the Louisiana Purchase, the United States did, for a song. And of course, Britain didn't like France, and so they actually did a lot of the booting out of France long before we purchased that last little holding that France had in Louisiana. Now, for a long time, the West Coast was owned by Spain and Mexico, and Spain was ruling through Mexico into the United States. And we all know about the Alamo, what happened at the Alamo. And then General Houston came and chased them, the Juristas back across the border there. And rather than going into Mexico and claiming parts of Mexico for the United States, they stopped at the border. Houston, it was like that's all he wanted, was to get them out of what we now considered a part of our country. And so we defeated 3 horns. Now that we're grown up, after World War I and World War II, we have now spread our democracy and our quote-unquote freedom all over the world. There isn't really any monarchies left. They're democracies, or republics. Even the People's Republic of China, even though we think of it as socialism, it is still based on democracy. It is a republic. So is Russia. It's a republic. The USSR is a republic. And so this ideology of Greece that began in Greece and flourished in Rome and is passed down, even though Europe went into having monarchies and went backwards a little bit for a short while, under King John, we had the Magna Carta and the rights of man that grew, the ideologies under Montesquieu and Voltaire, writing about how the common man has these rights and is just as good as any aristocrat. They're just as valuable. And so these ideas, they flourished. And when King John really was taking his kingship he was taking the different aristocracy's wives for his own and sleeping with them, and there was nothing anybody could do because divine right of kings. Well, the aristocracy got together and they made the Magna Carta, and they forced King John to sign it, in effect saying that he was going to rule jointly with his aristocracy. And not only that, but that he recognized that he's not divine. He's just like any other common man, and so there should be some type of common decency, right? King James eventually balked against that and brought in some Vikings to try to, gain his kingdom back and gain his level of control back, but he failed. And so the Magna Carta became the example that the United States used to make its own constitution. And we find in England, they have democracy, and they have a Senate, and they have the two sides, just like Julius Caesar had. They have the House of Lords and the House of Commons, whereas Julius Caesar saw that most of the senators were aristocracy, and so he loaded up the Senate with some plebs, some common people. So it had two halves, two equal halves, rich and common man. And we did ours a little slightly differently than that. We have the House of Representatives and the senators. Not necessarily based on, wealth versus common man. Although if we had done it that way, if we had been explicit in that's the way that we were going to do things, I think we would have a lot less corruption today in our government. But we didn't do it that way, because at the time when the founding fathers created the Constitution, they all considered themselves common men. They didn't consider themselves wealthy billionaires. They weren't, even though some of them were landowners and had slaves and and had these plantations or whatever. They didn't look at themselves as being exceptionally wealthy or aristocratic. So anyway, the prophecy goes that during the time of this horn exists, that's when the kingdom will be built. So the good news about this prophecy is that, if the United States is this little horn, then we're going to help to usher in a new age of wealth and freedom and incorruptible government and just good living for all the peoples of the earth. So let's talk about the second beast that's in Revelation. And I'll need to pull up the scripture here. So it talks about a second beast. And I beheld, and another beast coming up out of the earth had two horns like a lamb, but it spake as the dragon. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Okay? So here, the second beast looks like a lamb. First of all, it comes up out of the earth. And there's a slight difference between the earth and the sea. We know that the sea represents all peoples, nations, and tongues, whereas the earth is a little different than that. The earth represents something that's stable. It's the stable part of humanity. They aren't warring against each other. The sea is unstable. It's moving. It's changing. The waves are crashing into each other. There's animosity there. But when you come out of the earth, it's stable. It's not warring against each other. It's got some level of peace. That's why Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth." And when John sees himself, he sees himself standing not in the sea, but on the earth. Now, the lamb is definitely representing the Christ, because, in the Old Testament, the lamb is the common man. But here, the lamb is the Christ. It looks like the Christ, but it speaks like the dragon. It looks like the Christ. So we're talking about Christianity here. We're talking about a Christian nation, someone who is following the Christ. It looks like the Christ, but it speaks like the dragon. And this lamb that speaks like the dragon exercises all the power of the first beast. And in verse 13, and he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of man. And he deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of these miracles, which he had the power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by the sword, and did live. And he had the power to give life unto the image of the beast, and the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Okay, so this lamb is able to produce miracles. And with these miracles, he deceives the whole world into worshiping the beast. Now, this description that John gives of the miracle-producing lamb is the same description that Paul gave of the man of sin. And I'm going to read that. That's found in 1 Thessalonians. Let me see if I can. 2 Thessalonians, I'm sorry. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He says, now I beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by our gathering together to him, that ye be not shaken in mind or troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. In other words, he says, don't let anybody fool you. The day of Christ isn't here yet. Let no man deceive you by any means. For that day, the day that Christ returns, that day won't come except that there come a falling away first, and that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. So people have to fall away from the faith first. They have to stop believing in God and no longer feel that there's any need to have God, so that the son of perdition, this one who's causing all of these changes to occur, can be revealed. This person who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Remember ye not that, when I was yet with you, I told you these things? And now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he that now holds it back will until he be taken out of the way. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. In other words, when people talk about Armageddon, they think of this great spiritual war or this supernatural thing happening. No, he says that this wicked one, this wickedness will be revealed by the spirit of the mouth. That is, someone starts talking about it and revealing the truth. And people the light bulb goes up, ting, and they say, oh my God, that's true. And that is what causes them to start people to start moving in the right direction and moving away from what this man of sin, this son of perdition, is causing everybody to move in the wrong direction, you see. But by the spirit of the mouth is how he is defeated. And he shall be destroyed with the brightness of his coming, even him whose coming is after the working of Satan and all powers and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them a strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, and that they all might be damned who believe not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness, So he talks about this one that he opposes God, and he tries to set himself up as if he is God. And he has all these signs and lying wonders. And he deceives with all deceivableness. You know, he's doing all these miracles in order to deceive. This is the one we have to look for. So this second beast is the same as the man of sin. Now, this prophecy of the man of sin that Paul gave is the same as the prophecy of Tyre. Now, Tyre is a very long prophecy. It actually takes up 3 or 4 chapters. And I'm not reading that entire thing, but I will read the part where Tyre is sitting trying to make himself into God. Now, that part we can look at together. And that is in Ezekiel. I believe it's chapter 28, or it's either chapter 28 or chapter 30. So give me a minute here while I go look for it. Yes, it's in Ezekiel chapter 28. He says in verse 2, Son of man, say to the prince of Tyrus, thus saith the Lord God. Before I get into this, the prophecy of Tyre is about a merchant king. This merchant king has gotten the whole world to buy into his merchandising. He buys and he sells, and he gets all this merchandise to be distributed all over the world. And everybody takes a part in this process. Now, at this part, Tyre is now got it in his heart that since he's successful, he's getting rich and everything, that he must be God, right? He says, because thine heart is lifted up and thou hast said, I am a God, I sit in the seat of God and in the midst of the seas, yet thou art a man and not God, though thou set thine heart as the heart of God. Behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that they can hide from thee. With thy wisdom and with thine understanding thou hast gotten thee riches, and thou hast gotten gold and silver into thy treasures. And by thy great wisdom and by thy traffic, that is the buying and selling of these materials or this merchandise, thou hast increased thy riches, and thine heart is lifted up because of thy riches. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, because thou hast set thine heart as the heart of God, behold, therefore I will bring strangers upon thee, the terrible of the nations, and they shall draw their swords against thy beauty of thy wisdom, and they shall defile thy brightness. He also says of Tyre that thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. So in other words, Tyre is going to be the entity that figures everything out, how everything works. The sum of knowledge for this age is fulfilled by Tyre. But because of this great knowledge, he feels that he is God. And he sits on the throne of God. And, hey, he's buying and selling all his stuff. Now, the other thing about the prophecy of Tyre is he has two things going for him. He has great merchandise, and he has a most wonderful army. And these things are the beauty, are considered his beauty. So if we go back, the other thing about Tyre is it's a play on the capital city of the land of Canaan. The capital city of the land of Canaan was a port city called Tyre. And Canaan, the Hebrew word for Canaan, means merchant. So the land of Canaan is the land of the merchants. And Tyre is the capital city of the land of the merchants. And Israel, which means God prevails, inherits the land of Canaan. Israel inherits the land of the merchants. So all of this stuff is hidden inside this story of the day of judgment is hidden inside of the entire Bible. These things are hidden in symbolism. Even Israel itself is a symbol of something, and the land of Canaan is a symbol of something, and you can figure it out by looking at its true meaning. So all of this is a play showing that Canaan is the merchants of Tyre, and Israel inherits that. So the kingdom will inherit the land of the merchants, or the time of the merchants. So when we go back and we look at the beast, we find that the beast is responsible for all the buying and selling. It is the king of the merchants. No man might buy or sell save that he have the mark or the name of the beast and the number of his name. So he controls buying and selling. But there's another part of this that goes with this. So we talked about the lamb, and this lamb, the second beast, is promoting the first beast through all of its, all of its powers, its miracles. It deceives a lot of people into buying into this beast, which we now know is a descendant of Greece and comes from Rome and the 10 kingdoms of Rome, which are the 10 horns, and is probably, most likely, the United States. But now let's switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the beast again, but sitting on top of the beast is a woman, the Great Harlot, Babylon the Great. And she rides on top of this beast, and upon her forehead is a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And we talked about Babylon being that special thing, the beginning of all things and the end of all things. It's the beginning and the end. And so Babylon is sitting like a drunken woman, drunk with the blood of the saints, with the martyrs of Jesus. She's sitting on top of this beast, controlling it. And he goes on to say, and the 10 horns that thou saw on the beast, these are going to hate the whore, and these are going to make her desolate and naked, and they'll eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God be fulfilled. Now, the language that John uses here for the harlot, where the beast hates the harlot and is going to burn her with fire and eat her flesh, this corresponds to the prophecy of Nahum. And Nahum wrote about, let's just see if I can find it here. Nahum wrote about Babylon, except when he calls her, in his prophecy in chapter 3, he calls her the bloody city that's full of robbery. And he says, because of the multitude of your whoredoms of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcraft, that selleth nations through her whoredoms and families through her witchcrafts, I am against you, says the Lord. And he calls her Nineveh. Well, Nineveh is another euphemism for Babylon. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, and at Daniel's point in time, Assyria had already been conquered by Babylon. And so the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire were one and the same thing. The interesting thing about Assyria is that Assyria, before it was conquered by Babylon, was the empire that took out the 10 tribes of Israel, because Israel had split into two parts. The 10 tribes of Israel went and they had their capital in Samaria, and Judah and the remnants of Benjamin stayed in Jerusalem. And so the two had split into two parts. Well, Assyria attacked and conquered Israel and got rid of them. And they went into captivity, and who knows what happened to them. They disappeared. They got scattered amongst the nations is what happened. And then Judah in Jerusalem stayed for another several hundred years, and then Babylon, after it had conquered Assyria, now came back and took out the rest of Israel in Jerusalem. So when the Bible uses Nineveh instead of Babylon, we're talking about all 12 tribes of Israel. Now, we're talking about the entirety of everything. We're talking about both halves of Babylon. We're talking about all of it. And he goes on to say that there shall be a fire that devours thee, and the sword will cut thee off, and it shall eat thee up like the cankerworm. Well, a cankerworm is the pupa stage of a locust. He says, make thyself many as the cankerworm, make thyself many as the locust. Thou hast multiplied thy merchants above the stars of heaven. The cankerworm spoileth and fleeth away. Thy crown are as the locusts, and thy captains as the great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges in the cold day, but when the sun arises, they flee away, and their place is not known where they are. There is no healing of thy bruise, thy wound is grievous. All that bear the brunt of thee will clap their hands over thee, for upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually. So the prophecy of Nahum talks about the merchants as being like locusts. And there's a reason for this, because locust is a creature that eats up everything. They consume everything until nothing is left. And so the merchants, this is its crowning characteristic. A, they have become the captains and the honorable of the world, of the earth, just as Isaiah called them. You know, the merchants have become the honorable of the earth. Well, this is a time period when merchants have taken over everything. They are the captains and the rulers. And this Nineveh, this Babylon, has multiplied her merchants to the point where they're everywhere. And she's selling whole nations and families through her whoredoms. But now back to this locust. The locusts eat up everything. And so we're finding that in this modern age, there are several things that are true. This is the first time in history that the rulers of the world are not some conquering army, or not from some general that conquered and set up his family as a dynasty of rulers. This is the first time that's happened. Instead, the rulers of the world, the most honorable of the world, are now merchants. There are corporations now that make way more money than some of the largest nations. You know, like whole governments do not earn that kind of money. They're not as wealthy as some of these corporations. And so this is talking about a very specific time period. The merchants are more than the stars of heaven. And this line right here calls into mind the prophecy of Lucifer. All of the leaders are merchants. And it is these leaders, it is these cankerworms, it is these locust that shall burn her with fire. So if the second beast is Babylon the Great, and she's the one that is, causing everyone to follow after these, and yet the same beast is going to turn around and destroy her because they don't want her around anymore. They want it to be their own. Whenever somebody's riding something, it's the rider that's controlling. So they're going to turn around and burn her with fire so that they're not under her control anymore. And that's what causes the deadly wound. Well, now the question is the beast from the beast that rose out of the sea, can it be connected to locusts? And the answer to that is yes. And Revelation chapter 9, it talks about the abyss being opened, the bottomless pit, and there arose smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given the power as scorpions of the earth have power. So that which came out of the pit is looked at as being locusts. But in chapter 17, the beast that the harlot is riding, the beast comes out of the pit. And where does it say that? And the beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they beheld the beast that was and is not and yet is. So this beast that arises out of the sea, is the same beast from the pit, and it's the same as the locusts that come out of the pit. That's why it has control over buying and selling, because it is actually merchants. The beast is in control of buying and selling, just as the merchants are in control of buying and selling. And it is because of this great buying and selling that we're doing, that we're eating through the resources. Like locusts, we're eating it all up. Eating up the oil, eating up the coal, eating up the precious metals. And this is what causes the end of the daily sacrifice. Now, Joel talks about this. If we go to Joel, and I believe it's in chapter 1, if I can just find it. Joel is such a small little book, it's hard to find. And I gotta find it. Joel. There it is. He talks about the locust as well, ending the daily sacrifice. He says, tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children another generation. So he talks about 3 generations here. That which the palmer worm hath left, hath the locust eaten. And that which the locust hath left, hath the cankerworm eaten. And that which the cankerworm hath left, hath the caterpillar eaten. Awake, ye drunkards, and weep, and howl, all ye drinkers of wine, because of the new wine, for it is cut off from your mouth. For a nation is come up upon my land, strong and without number, whose teeth are the teeth of a lion, and he hath the cheek teeth of a great lion, and he hath laid my vine to waste, and hath barked my fig tree. He hath made it clean bare, and cast it away, and the branches thereof are made white. Lament like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the husband of her youth. The meat offering and the drink offering is cut off from the house of the Lord, and the priest and the Lord's ministers mourn. The field is wasted. The land mourneth, for the corn is wasted. The new wine is dried up, and the oil languish. Okay, so it's describing a time when the locusts have eaten up everything, and so there is no more daily sacrifice. You can't take one portion of grain, one serving of grain, and burn it. You can't take one serving of wine because there is no wine, there is no grain, there's nothing. It's gone. So now we talk about the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast is the same as the mark of God. In Deuteronomy and in, I believe it is Exodus, he talks about, when you put the law in your mind, it becomes, when you concentrate on the law and you really think about the law, it becomes a mark on your forehead. It becomes like a teflon around your forehead and on your right hand. So the mark of God is when you take the law and you think about it and you contemplate it and you understand it and you start to do and make things so that keeping the law is easy, so that you don't really need a written law anymore. It's just kind of built in. Well, the mark of the beast is just that. You start thinking like the beast. You start thinking like a merchant. And your whole way of thinking is based on the way of the locust, of buying and selling, of using, of getting stuff cheap and selling it high. I mean, this is what consumes your mind. And any of those who don't think like that, well, that's your own fault if you don't scramble and buy into this way of doing things. If you're not participating, it's your own fault if you're starving to death, right? It is allowed to kill you if you don't worship it. And when you do, you receive the mark. You're like, hey, I bought into this whole system, this whole way of doing things. And this number, 666. Well, a lot of people say that Nero, this number is associated with Nero, because if you take the Latin or the Greek name, the Greek spelling of Nero's name, his entire name, it adds up to 666. Because like Hebrew, Greek has gematria included with it. It has a gematria. So you can take the letters and add them up, and they form an amount. However, I have a different take on this number. There's only one event in the Bible where 666 is mentioned. And that is the amount of gold that Solomon was able to collect in taxes from the people in order to build the temple. This did not include the taxes on the merchants and on other things. It was only the taxes on the people. Now in the Bible, when Solomon died and his son, Rehoboam, or however you pronounce his name, took control, and the first thing the people asked for was an abatement of the tax. They said that your father, he taxed us pretty heavy to build that temple. We'll follow you as long as you cut back on some of the taxes. Well, Rehoboam, he talked about it with his friends who are all his age, and they're like, man, if you show weakness, they won't respect you. You need to, and what you supposed to live on, and how are you supposed to live a lavish life, and how are you supposed to, do this and that. So he listened to his young advisors, and some of his dad's advisors went to him and said, listen to the people. If you want them to follow you, you need to listen to them and give some concession. And his friends were talking in his ear, and he dismissed his father's advisors and listened to his friends. And they said, tax them even more than what your father did. You want to be a greater king than your father. And so that's what led to the split of Israel. Those taxes that were levied against the people. Not only that, there's something else about the temple that people don't know. The temple wasn't built by Israel, it was built by Tyre. The Bible says that in exchange for gold, silver, copper, and lead, or iron, lead or iron, however you want to, gold, silver, bronze, and iron is the way some of them translated, and wood and woodworkers and metalsmiths and craftsmen and all this other good stuff, for all these artisans and for all the materials, the raw materials, in exchange for that, Israel would give Tyre bread and wine and oil. Now this is a symbolic bread, wine, and oil. And I'm not going to get into the symbolisms of what the bread and the wine and the oil mean. If you can understand what those things mean, you'll also understand what Jesus said, this is my body, I break it for you, this is my blood. The equivalency is there. But this is not what we're going to talk about right now. What I do want to tell you is that the raw materials which went into making the temple, which is symbolic of the kingdom, comes from Tyre and its activities. And so this tax money that was put on the people, this 666, was money that was used to pay Tyre to build the temple. And so all the trees that were in the temple are from Lebanon. They're from the land of Canaan. They're and controlled by Tyre. All of this stuff that went into building this temple. So Tyre has a big hand in providing the raw materials for building the kingdom. So he's a necessary thing to have. And yet, the people who worship him, they're not written in the book. You have to stop worshiping. You have to see him for who he is. He's not an evil guy. He's just doing what he's doing because it's a necessary step to get us from A to B. We need this technology that is coming out of this time of mercantilism. We need this technology in order to build the kingdom where none suffers. But if we keep going in this direction, we'll never build the kingdom. We'll be led off until there's nothing left. There's no resources left. We don't want to go that path. Let's just skip to the end. How about that? How about we not go down the path where we go down the path of darkness, where we choose keep following the beast, even though we know that they're locusts that are eating up everything. So there's a significance here. There's another significance to 666, where different events in the Bible that are 600 are denoted by 600 or 60 or 6 have to do with characteristics of this time period that we're talking about. For example, when the flood came, Noah was 600 years old. It came exactly in his 600th year. Seth, when he finally died, he died when he was 600 years old, and he outlived 9 generations. It is actually in the 9th generation, he outlived 8 generations, and in the 9th generation, when Abraham came on the scene, is when Seth died. He did not outlive Abraham. He got to meet Abraham. He got to see him, but he didn't outlive him. So the 600 years there is the bringing on of this splinter out of Babylon that made or created or started the promise of Israel. And so these things are symbolic of other things. The Palestinian, Goliath, when David went against Goliath, he is called the giant with 6 fingers. Okay? And remember, he was from the land of Canaan. He represents the merchants. He's this giant thing. How do we defeat this giant thing that seems invincible? So all of this is symbolic of other things. Now that we've gone through this prophecy, we can see a little bit more how Nero does not quite fit. He's not the king of the merchants. He had nothing to do with merchandising, period. Neither did the papacy. In fact, we are living in this time period right now. It's just not unfolding in the supernatural way that people have depicted it up until now. It is not some supernatural fight. It is a fight for our hearts and our minds in loving each other enough to put aside all of our greed and self-serving tendencies in order to build the kingdom where none suffers. I look forward to people asking questions. You may post your question on YouTube, or you can go to the meetup section and post it there under the meetup topic. I also have a Facebook page called Christian and Jewish Symbology where this video will be posted, and you can post your questions there. And I look forward to talking with you again the next time for another presentation. Have a good one.